Our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Andrew Mackenzie Gospel. Andrew has been a research scientist in weed science at AAFC, Charlottetown Research and Development Center, since 2016. Andrew obtained his Bachelor of Science in Ecology from Trent University and a PhD in weed science from the University of Guelph. He studies novel weed management tactics, cover crops, and weed ecology of cropping systems in Atlantic Canada. Andrew regularly provides presentations at producer and industry events and field days, and has authored and co-authored over 20 peer-reviewed manuscripts on cover crops, weed biology, and integrated weed management. In addition to his research activities, he interacts with the public and conservation groups to provide advice and promotes sustainable weed management. In his spare time, Andrew enjoys camping, hiking, and spending time with his growing family. Andrew is here this afternoon to discuss weed management strategies and crop rotation and talk about some novel approaches to weed control. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to be talking to you today about kind of some ecological approaches to weed management, a little bit on potatoes, but more just kind of in general weed management throughout your rotations, as well as I'm going to touch on a little bit of some species modeling and predictive modeling that we've been working on in a couple of different systems in the last few years, and that we're continuing to work on and develop. Okay, so don't have to tell you, but weed competition costs Canadian producers a lot of money. So on average, across North America, weeds reduce potato yields by approximately 44%. That's a large study that we published just last year looking at just average impact of weeds on potato yields from a variety of studies going back, I think, about 30 years. In potato, we have minimal herbicide options. They're primarily just a few pre-emerge options, and especially minimal broadleaf options after the potato has come up. And we're also, obviously, we've shifted towards reduced cultivation, less frequent passes in the field. That obviously has some benefits in terms of saving, or for soil erosion as well as fuel savings. But each one of those passes is removing one of those passes is removing a weed control pass within that field. So it's not just potatoes that weeds impact. This is from data from a couple of different studies, again, just across all of North America, trying to quantify the impact of weeds on crop productivity and the impact on crop productivity. And you're looking at about 20% yield loss in spring and winter wheat. And just because of the acreage there, you're just looking at a lot higher value. But then in soybean and corn, you're looking at approximately upwards of 50% yield loss, equating to almost $20 billion lost to North American producers annually. So weeds cause a lot of problems. And increasingly, we're dealing with situations of herbicide resistance. So this is some work we did a couple of years ago with some colleagues, both with the provinces in New Brunswick and PEI. And here we were looking for herbicide-resistant common lamb's quarters in potato fields. Each one of those squares is a potato field, and a lamb's quarter population that we sampled. All of those green squares are populations that are still susceptible. So in this case, we were looking for Sencor resistance. So Sencor still works on lamb's quarters in those fields. But all of those red ones are populations that were resistant to Sencor. So Sencor no longer works on any of those fields. Fortunately, the resistance mechanism that we have in our common lamb's quarter populations does leave them susceptible to Lorox, so that product still works, but for Sencor, it's really a no-go there. And we've surveyed, I think it's about 150 fields now, and are consistently getting about half of the fields that we survey have a resistant population in them. As I mentioned, that's mostly common lamb's quarters, but we're starting to pick up some more red root pigweed. So here's a population sprayed from 0 up to 4 times the label rate of Sencor, and it's just completely surviving. And then we more recently got a population, we haven't tested it yet, but historically Lorox would work on pigweed, but we have a population that has the mutation that should give it resistance to both of these products, so neither of these products is going to work on that population. But we haven't validated that in the greenhouse. So we're hopefully spraying that next week. to validate that. But at least it has the mutation to tell us, or that tells us that it's going to be resistant to both of these products. So eliminating both of those out of your toolbox in that field. And that was from a producer's field in PEI. So a lot of conventional weed management, it's really focused on what we call these technological fixes. So that is using single technologies or relying on technologies to solve a lot of our weed problems, with little attention paid to the inherent ecology of our systems. And that's what a lot of our herbicides are doing. They're fixing problems that we have and ignoring the ecology of our system. If we can build up the resiliency of our system and focus more on on building up that ecology, we can form an ecological foundation in our cropping system that's going to make it more resilient to weed infestation and more resilient against and allow any particular or reduce the resiliency on any particular tool. This is my first talk in like 5 months. I was on parental leave, so I am sorry if my mind is still a little bit scrambled. Yeah, so in ecological weed management, we're not trying to achieve fields that are completely weed-free. That's really not the goal, and I don't think that's the really sustainable goal. Weeds do a lot of good things for our systems. That's kind of one of my main goals that I want to achieve in my career as a weed scientist, is to try to tell people that weeds aren't so bad. Really, the main goal of ecological weed management is to improve a crop's ability to compete with weeds. Again, it's not to try to eliminate weeds, but it's to try to increase that crop's ability to compete with weeds so that there's less impact on crop productivity. And yeah, just reduce the impact on crop productivity. So if we look at a traditional potato rotation in a region, we have barley underseeded to red clover, followed by red clover, and then potato. And from the outset, that already is a decent rotation for weed management. We are putting in there a cereal that's going in early, then we have a perennial crop that's coming up after, and then we're going into potato. We have diverse herbicide options, we have diverse management tactics, so already that's a pretty decent rotation. But a lot of the weed management in that rotation, in terms of herbicides, is primarily going to come in the form of maybe if you're an underseeded, it's going to be 2,4-DB. If you're not, it'll probably be Refine or Refine M. Then you may not use another herbicide except maybe glyphosate to terminate that red clover, and then go to a photosystem 2 inhibitor in your potato, either Sencor or Lorox. And that might be the only weed management you do. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But how can we take an ecological approach to try and build up the resiliency in this system to manage weeds in this rotation? Because even though we have this decent rotation here with all of these weed management options, you know, weeds are still a major issue in our potato crop. We're still ending up with the loss of tools like from things like herbicide resistance developing. So a lot of the work that we do in my lab is just trying to find and figure out different weed management strategies that might fit in this rotation. So instead of seeding barley red clover, you might go in with a different cereal or a pulse crop. If you know, we could seed like a pea that can go really, really early. We can get different herbicide options in there, and that might open us up to be able to seed a winter cover crop immediately following that. We can maintain green cover over that field, and then we harvest that cereal crop. Maybe we can put in a fall cover crop going into potato. We terminate that, seed potato, go fall cover crop again, and we filled up that 3-year rotation with something green living on that soil that we've planted that we want there throughout those full 3 years. And we've not allowed any opportunity or reduced the opportunity for weeds to establish within that rotation. So when we're building up any rotation and trying to think about what weeds we might be targeting, you know, it's probably not possible to just say, I want to control every single weed in our fields. We need to try and think about which weed is the most problematic and then build strategies to deal with that particular problem at that time, while also just trying to reduce it down to become to like an economic level where it's manageable. And then, yeah, so the way we would do about that is you think about the particular weed that you're dealing with. Here we've got just generic annual A. So these are emerging from seeds, seeds in the spring. We get seedling establishment and new plant growth here. This is a stage where a lot of our herbicides are going to work and try and target a lot of those new emerging seedlings. But anything that isn't controlled or emerges after our herbicide no longer works. Those have the opportunity to form into reproductive adults. They're going to collect your resources. That's going to determine your seed set, and then eventually produce new seeds and moving over into the fall. If we haven't interrupted that life cycle, those new seeds are going to be shed into that seed bank. We may get some seed mortality, but anything that survives in over the winter is going to then potentially emerge the next season into our fields as new seedlings. And so what we want to try and do is we take into account the particular weed that we're focused on and know about when it's going to emerge, when does it produce seeds, how long do those seeds remain viable in that seed bank, and try and target and interrupt the different stages of that life cycle with our different management tactics. So a lot of weeds, unfortunately, have a continuous emergence pattern throughout the growing season, but they do have some periodic flushes that we can then take advantage of. So we've got two different graphs here looking at just weed emergence. So the one on your right, that's just from a published paper from some weed scientists in the northeastern U.S. I believe this data there is from, it's either Maine or Delaware, so the closest data set within that paper to our location. And a lot of our weeds emerge in more or less that same kind of pattern. So this is called a violin plot. It's maybe not the easiest to understand, but basically, if you have time moving through here throughout the growing season, where this plot is wider indicates more of that particular species emerging at that time frame. So you take something like redroot pigweed and you have that initial flush here, but then you get a later flush later on in the growing season. Compare that with quackgrass or couchgrass. Really no emergence early on, but all of your emergence is happening down here in the fall. So this here on your left, we've got more or less the same thing, but just in a different type of plot. And this is data that we collected in Harrington. And so this is just number of emerged seedlings in a fallow potato, or in a field that's been fallowed following potato. So we didn't do anything. We harvested potatoes the previous year, and then we just went in and then counted the number of seedlings that were emerging in the next year over a series of weeks. And so this field has herbicide-resistant common lamb's quarters in it, and it's following potatoes, so that's why you see like this just massive amount of common lamb's quarters, which is that dark green emerging early on. But we have some of the other kind of common species, so that's low cudweed, that's that red thing there, corn spurry, again, these things are emerging earlier on, as well as some redroot pigweed, which is the orange here. Compare that to later in the season, we start to get our lamb's quarters dying off or the emergence slowing down, but then it peaks again in the fall. But here, that orange there is your annual bluegrass and some of your small crabgrass, so those things that emerge later on in the season. So knowing when the particular weed of concern that you're trying to deal with emerges will tell you when you need to go in there to try and interrupt, again, that life cycle with whatever management practice suits that crop that you're looking at. So I have a couple slides here that are probably the most informative that I have in this presentation. And this just lists a couple of the major weeds, annual weeds, as well as couchgrass added there as well. And then their emergence pattern, as well as their longevity within that seed bank, the seed production per individual, and then emergence to seed. So knowing when these particular weeds emerge is going to tell you when you need to go in with an early or with your initial weed management tactic to try and prevent emergence of or destroy some of these seedlings. And then, again, it's important to know when they start to produce viable seeds, because then that tells us when, if our initial management practice didn't work, when we need to go in to try and prevent that initial seed production from dumping those seeds back into the seed bank. This gives you a rough estimate of the number of seeds per plant. That's going to be highly variable. I mean, lamb's quarter plants, a big, giant, bushy one, that's one that's going to produce 70,000 seeds per plant. But lamb's quarters that emerge later on, you know, even that might be 2 or 3 centimeters tall, they can still complete their life cycle, but they're only going to be producing, you know, maybe like 50 seeds at max. So a huge amount of variability within the amount of seeds being produced per plant. But then the other important factor here is seed bank longevity. So a lot of these seeds are going to stick around in that seed bank for decades. And a lot of them, we really don't know how long they can survive. There's been studies going on. I can't remember the name of the fellow who planted a whole bunch of weed seeds over 100 years ago in the UK in glass bottles, and we keep exhuming them, and they continually have viable seeds within them. So yeah, anyway, the actual seed bank longevity of any of these species, a lot of them, it's really not known, just that it lasts for 20, 30, 50 years or more. But what's important is that the viability of these species tends to decline quite rapidly. So a lot of them, you're looking at almost 50% reduction in viability per year. So if you think about that, if you've heard the adage of if you have a weed, you're going to deal with it for 7, that's where a lot of this is coming from. So if you let a weed go to seed and it produces lamb's quarters and produces 70,000 seeds, even though those might be viable for decades, again, those 70,000 seeds, that next year only 35,000 of those are going to be viable, and then the next year 15,000, and slowly it's going to rapidly decline in viability. But if you allow any of those cohorts to then set seed, you're basically resetting everything. And that's why and how we end up with these massive amounts of seed that have built up within our seed bank. And I don't think I have the slide here, but we've done some work just looking at where viable seeds are within the seed bank. And so we have a lot of tillage here, which tends to, it will mix the soil up. And so in Western Canada, where they have a lot less tillage, they tend to get a concentration of the seeds really in that top 5 centimeters where they're all emerging from. And so we do have the same thing where, you do get a concentration in that top 5 centimeters. But from there beyond, it's basically completely homogeneous. So from 5 centimeters all the way down to 30, 50 centimeters, we have basically the same amount of weed seed and viable weed seed present within that seed bank. So we have lamb's quarter seed that are viable 50 to 60 or 50 centimeters down into the soil. And when you go and then plow, we're just going to bring those back up. Okay, so we know what weed we're dealing with in a particular cropping system. Then it's important to try and pick management options that are going to then target that particular species. So here we've got just a list of a whole bunch of pre-emerge herbicides that you might be familiar with, or products that I've come across speaking with people within the region. So things that are going to be more common here. This is nowhere near an exhaustive list of pre-emerge herbicides that can be sold here. And I will say the use of any of these trade names does not constitute my endorsement of any of these. This is just kind of what they're known as to me, or the most common name. And so here, on that top row, we've got all of our different crops. And so I've just coded them based on C is for corn, S is soybean, P is for potato, M is for mustard, WW winter wheat, FR fall rye, and just W there is just wheat. So that tells you what crop you can use each one of these herbicides in. And then the next important thing, especially when you're dealing with pre-emerges, is the recropping interval, because that's going to tell you whether or not that's going to fit within your cropping rotation. So your recropping interval is going to be longer generally for any of your pre-emerges, and that's a good thing. We want those pre-emerges to stick around in our soil so that they're acting out, or they're acting on a lot of our weed species. Here on the recropping interval, if you see CER, that's just cereal, so that's all of your cereals. But then I think the rest of all the codes, I guess there's O for oat there on treff land. But if you have a particular weed species, you can read this. This is very similar to the charts that are available or published by the PEI Department of Agriculture, or OMAFRA publishes the same type of thing, or Government of Alberta has their blue book. And these are all these weed control charts that show you which herbicide you can use to control particular weeds in different crops. And then we've got just the rating system here from 0 to 10. 0 means it's not going to control it at all. Up to 10, which I didn't include any 10s here, would be complete control. But you can see some 9s here, 8s, 7s. Those are all going to indicate good levels of control. When you're getting down around 7, 6, you're getting towards more suppression and may not give you an acceptable level of weed control. There are a couple blanks here, and I just wasn't able to find any options or any information on those. So you notice, like, bed straw, it's becoming more of an issue here. There is, I think, maybe 1 or 2 pre-emerges that are effective on bed straw, but they're not really used here. I've just never come across them, but they do exist. So I would always advocate to try to use pre-emerges over post-emerges, but I think use a post-emerge herbicide when required. So if your pre-emerge fails, the one important thing about pre-emerge herbicides is we have to rely on herbicide activation. So spraying the herbicide on top of the soil, yeah, there's seeds on the soil, but most of the seeds that are going to become a problem, or the weeds, are actually within that soil. So we need to move that herbicide down into that soil profile where all those weed seeds are germinating from. And so that's why we talk about we need like that activating rain or maybe a little bit of tillage or irrigation or something like that to move that herbicide in. If that doesn't happen and our pre-emerge doesn't work, I think was it 2 or 3 years ago when nobody's pre-emerge herbicide worked because nobody got rain at the right time, and then everybody was out hilling all their fields again. But if that happens, you can also rely on post-emerges. So yeah, I'd say use post-emerges more when required than as kind of like a set, no, yeah, I'm always going to do this. Again, read this exactly the same as the previous one, but there's a little bit more information here. So again, we've got our herbicides just across the top, and again, I've just chosen ones that are kind of common to our area. Again, nowhere near close to being exhaustive to what could be used in PEI. And then we've got our crops. The first 2 herbicides there, Aero Select, that's clethodim. I think you can use it in basically every single broadleaf crop. And then Post or Sethoxydim, again, basically the same. But then you've got your more selective herbicides that will be used in some either cereals or broadleaf crops. And again, just coded the same way as before. We've got our recropping intervals there, and so generally it's a lot shorter than any of our pre-emerges, except for a couple of them, and because some of them do have some residual activity. And then again, we've got our just weed control ratings across all of our different species, from 0 to 10. And then we've also added in here leaf staging, so the staging that you want to try and target any of these weed species for those products to be effective. It's always more effective, or you're always going to be more successful at controlling any of these species the earlier you go, but there's a trade-off there because you may be then missing ones that are going to emerge after your application. So as a weed gets taller, you're going to need more product to be able to control that thing, as well as the cuticle is going to get thicker. You're going to get more hair developing, that type of thing. That's just going to make it harder for that product to actually get into that particular weed species and make it harder to control. So you are going to want to try to go earlier is usually always better. But yeah, there is a guideline here where it's generally up to around the 4-leaf stage. And you know, if you're going to try and control something that's like that big with a herbicide, you're probably not going to have much luck anyway, regardless of what it is. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about cover crops now. I've done a lot of work with cover crops and try to use cover crops as for weed management and weed suppression. But this is a slide I stole from a workshop that Perennia put on, where they had I can't remember the fellow's name from Penn State come up to talk about herbicide use in corn and then seeding in cover crops. So these are, in this experiment here, they just used these 3 different herbicides. Zidua, Dual, or Outlook or Frontier on corn, and then seeded in cover crops at the V6 stage of corn. So just broadcast seeded those in. And they looked at all of these different cover crop species across those 3 different herbicides and basically just ranked them of green, safe, no problem, red, problematic, do not do it. So you can see here if you've seeded in or if you've used Zidua on your corn, probably not a good idea to go and use a brassica cover crop seeded into that standing corn. Same with buckwheat. But if you've used Dual on your corn, there shouldn't be any problem with brassicas. So yeah, a really great little slide there. Because there's more and more, as more and more people are getting interested in cover crops, there's more and more questions around, you know, what are our herbicides doing to some of these cover crops? I'm spending all this money on cover crop seed. Is my herbicide that I've used gone and just killed it anyway? Okay, so we've mostly been focusing just on annual management or annual weed management now. So I just want to touch on perennial weed management. There's a couple of major problematic perennials that show up in potato production, things like field mint, common mugwort, quackgrass. So for perennial weed management, it's really, we want to focus mainly on depletion of rhizome reserves. A lot of those species seeds are not a major source of new populations. In the literature, it says mugwort doesn't produce viable seeds, but I think it does here. I think we've seen it. And quackgrass does produce viable seeds, but things like field mint, I'm not sure if it does. It's mainly spread by rhizomes. So the whole focus of perennial weed management is really on the depletion of rhizome reserves. So if you're going with early tillage, oftentimes want to try and chop those rhizomes up into the smallest possible fragments. It is going to create a huge problem, but you've set those individual rhizomes back quite far. Then you want to try and target cultivation to sensitive growth stages, or herbicide application. So it's going to be very specific to the particular weed species you're dealing with, but when these perennial weeds are emerging from those rhizomes, they're relying on those rhizome reserves for that early growth. And there's that kind of switch where it's going from rhizome growth to relying on more photosynthetic tissue for its development. And when that switch is occurring is when you want to try and target your cultivation or herbicide or whatever your management activity is. That's when the rhizome reserves are going to be at the weakest, and it is most susceptible to being controlled. Post-harvest mowing, tillage, or herbicide application, oftentimes that would be glyphosate, can reduce rhizome reserves in the fall. So in the fall, these things are trying to build up their rhizome reserves so that they're ready and primed for the spring. So they're taking all of their photosynthates and metabolites and sending them down into the rhizome reserves. If we can get a herbicide on there, particularly something that translocates, something like glyphosate, it's going to get in there and then move down into the rhizome reserves and help kill that plant. So that's why we often talk about fall applications of glyphosate being most effective for perennial management. As well as winter cereals and a couple of different cover crops can be really effective at choking out and preventing perennial species from not only spreading and actually controlling them. So we've been running a large organic rotation for the last, I think, 7 years now out at Harrington, and we found that a strong established stand of hairy vetch is able to completely stop perennial sow thistle. We have a horrible perennial sow thistle problem. It's continuing to move through the field, but if we get a good stand of hairy vetch there, the rhizomes don't seem to be able to pass through it. They're not, at least in that species, not able to get past that plot. These are quite wide plots, and it's not really able to emerge into that stand. So we're able to at least go a long way towards choking it out in that stage of that rotation. In terms of fall cover crops, so we've done some work on with a variety of different species of winter cereals, winter barley, winter wheat, fall rye, as well as winter canola, and then we've also looked at winter pea. And so this is a little study I did with Aaron Mills over the last 5 years with the Living Labs project, where we seeded all of these different vernal species with and without winter pea. And we tried to target by September 15th, and about half the time, no matter what we did, they all died. Everything just winter killed. But when they didn't, we basically had no weeds there. So all the green tissue that's there, not a single one of those plants is a weed. The act of seeding gave us good weed control in the fall, and then these things emerged early enough in the spring that nothing else was able to emerge. If we go back, that's what the crop looked like later on in August. And again, we couldn't collect weed biomass in there. We didn't really find any positive effect of including winter pea in that mixture. It didn't improve biomass production. Winter pea, though, from what I understand, is a fairly cheap seed, so it can be a good option. I'd recommend it as a fall cover crop. But fall cover crops in general, as long as they're able to establish and overwinter, they can do a really good job at suppressing weed establishment, and with absolutely no herbicides. As well, we've done some work on looking at full season cover crops. So this is, again, an experiment with Aaron Mills where we looked at 20 different species and then 20 different mixtures, and then looked at weed suppression within the season. And we found that if we were able to produce approximately right around 600 grams per square meter of cover crop biomass, we're able to get upwards of 95% weed suppression. So basically nothing there. My colleague, Cameron Wagg, this is just another study, or very similar study. He basically copied everything we did and then just took a couple other measurements. But he found that here, these two graphs here, this is weed suppression on the y-axis, but these are related to increased canopy height and spring growth rate, which makes sense. These things that have higher spring growth rates are going to emerge earlier in the season and provide higher levels of weed suppression, as well as things that achieve a higher canopy height, again, to just shade everything else out. Yes?
On winter weed control, the herbicide on that, was that last bit of research where you're getting the 600 grams of ground matter? Does that lead you towards saying that a lot of times it should be field by field, whether the winter weed gets a fall herbicide application, or can you think of more instances, or weeds in particular, on winter weed management where you lean towards a fall application if you saw the weed present?
Sure. So if I had perennial weeds in that field that I wanted to seed to winter wheat, especially perennial grasses, I would absolutely be using glyphosate pre-seed. You're going to have no other options. So yeah, we had, and I've had this same question come up. We have annual bluegrass in one of our fields, and one year we did not spray it. We didn't spray it in the spring. But we did put a pre-emerge down, and then it went into pulses, and we had a terrible bluegrass problem that full year because we weren't able to control it. We didn't use a post-emerge grass herbicide just based on the trial. But then that fall, we sprayed that annual bluegrass off with Roundup and then seeded winter wheat, and it was not a problem at all. We didn't need a follow-up herbicide at all. Yeah, no herbicide in the winter wheat, no herbicide in the following season either. And we were able to get a good crop of winter wheat off of that. So in that situation, that annual bluegrass would be, if you have that, I would suggest going in with like a fall glyphosate application or something like couch grass. Any of those perennial grasses, if you're going to try and seed winter wheat, I would be going in with glyphosate first. Or if you're combining, if you're going to put a pre-emerge, like I think one of our technicians at the farm has used some pre-emerges on his winter wheat. And in that case, I would probably, again, combine it with glyphosate, depending on the weed species that are there. So for cover crops that we've grown, that consistently, we ran this experiment for 5 years, and the ones that will consistently, with the least amount of, like the lowest CVs for consistently producing high levels of cover crop biomass would be these. So pearl millet, sorghum Sudan grass, oats, buckwheat, phacelia, and any of our mustards, so things like brown mustard or our radishes, tillage radish, oilseed radish, any of those that we've tested, all really high levels of weed suppression consistently provide that 600 grams per square meter of biomass that'll give that 100% weed suppression. These cover crops, for this experiment, we would seed these kind of the first week of June. Then for management, we don't do anything else. We just mow them off in the fall. And then as part of this experiment, we then seeded in soybean right after. Oh, yeah. We seeded soybean in right after, and we sprayed those with Roundup in the spring and then direct seeded in soybean, and we didn't do anything else. We just relied on that cover crop mulch to provide that weed suppression. And if you went in there in the spring, not long after the soybeans came up, it would look like heck. There was every year a good crop of corn spurry that would be coming up with those soybeans. But that initial corn spurry has kind of like 3 cohorts. When that initial cohort of corn spurry died back down and those soybeans were left, there was no other weeds there. It was just a mat of cover crop mulch with corn spurry on top and those soybeans. And then, again, we didn't use any weed control in those soybeans. But over the last 5 years, this is our soybean yield following each one of these cover crops. And average soybean yield in the province is somewhere around 2 tons per hectare. And we were able to achieve higher than that with again, no weed management. These were Roundup Ready soybeans, so we could go in with Roundup if we wanted to for weed management, but we really didn't have to. One thing I also mentioned, if you don't want to just leave that cover crop on the soil as a mulch, it can also be incorporated. So this is a little greenhouse study we did where we took different cover crops, grew them up in pots. We took that biomass, chopped it up into little pieces, simulated mowing, and then incorporated into the top layer of the soil with a whole bunch of weed seeds. And we found that no matter what cover crop we incorporated, annual ryegrass, buckwheat, brown mustard, phacelia, or pea, got a significant reduction in germination percentage of our weed species. So that big giant bar there, Oops. This big bar here, that's our control, so that's no cover crop. So that's the germination percent when we didn't do anything. But then you can see a significant reduction as soon as we added in cover crop biomass. And we'll note that is also like we saw that kind of a dose response effect there, where when we incorporated more biomass, we got more reduction in weed seed germination. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of weed control in rotation. And then the other thing Margaret wanted me to talk about is just a little bit on some weed species modeling that we've been doing. So I'm just going to quickly highlight 3 individual little models that we've generated to try and determine weed species occurrence in abundance, or predict weed species occurrence in abundance. So we've got 3 different data sets I'm going to show. The first one is on wild blueberries in Nova Scotia. Second one is on forage fields in Nova Scotia, and the last one is on our soil quality monitoring network. So everything we've been talking about right now, all of these management, agronomic filters, weed management decisions, all of these act as what we call ecological filters. And they end up selecting for or against particular weed species. So if we have this big box here, this is all of the weed species that are present in PEI right now. If we then choose a particular crop that's seeded in the spring, it's going to select for this group of weed species. And then we use a particular herbicide in that crop, it's going to select for these. And then maybe we do something else in the season, or we apply fertility or something like that. It's going to then further select for a smaller group of species. So each one of these management or agronomic decisions we make act as ecological filters on that population, selecting for and against different species. And so that's called, it's like our niche theory of community assembly, of how which weed species occur in different places. But because weeds have a seed bank and we have management decisions, predicting how they're going to actually occur is really challenging. So there's 2 main theories, 2 competing theories in the community ecology world. One is the niche-based assembly rules, and the other one is called neutral theory, which basically says everything is random. We cannot determine which species occur where. It's basically just luck of the draw. Whichever species occurs in a particular place first is going to be the one that is going to establish, and then as things come in, they're going to interact with that. And then that will ultimately determine how that community assembles. So predicting weeds, we can apply a lot of our niche-based rules. We know particular weed species are going to be favored by particular management decisions. We know some weeds are nitrophilic, they like nitrogen. Some weeds are going to be controlled by different herbicides. But there is going to be that large random component because, as I said, we have viable weed seeds that are found 30, 50 centimeters down that we then churn up when we go through and do like a tillage operation. So joint species distribution models, or JSDMs, they use this ecological theory to try and look at relationships between our different covariates that we incorporate and our actual species occurrences. So what these models do, and the ones that we've been using, is basically just a gigantic correlation matrix where you have a whole bunch of spreadsheets and you just mash them all together and try to find linkages between those and correlations between those. So we have our species occurrence. So that is, it could be each one of these fields, and then these are our species across the top. And then those are we can then take environmental variables or management decisions or whatever you want to try and model this based off of. Here's temperature, here's soil or moisture. And then we can combine those 2 things and look for correlations between those. But then these models, they're what we call hierarchical. So they can also combine things like species traits, how those traits interact with our environment, how the relationship between those species determines their interactions, and how the interactions between those species groups affect or depend on the environment as well as incorporate a spatial temporal context. So the location within those populations and those communities within space, as well as through time. And so they all kind of get combined into this. I can't remember the name of this type of diagram, but basically we have here, these are our fixed effects. If we think about like a normal ANOVA that we run to test for significance, and then we have over here would be our random effects, and we're all trying to determine Y, which is our species occurrence. So we've run these models on these 3 different data sets. These models take an incredibly long time to run, to resolve, to analyze. So they're all kind of, these are works in progress. This is the one that's most developed, that we've got kind of the biggest, most understanding of. So this, again, I mentioned it's a survey of wild blueberry fields. So we mapped or looked at 161 wild blueberry fields across Nova Scotia, so that's their locations there, and the weed species within each one of these fields. And then we've got here on the right, each one of these lines, I don't expect you to be able to read any of that, but each one of those lines is a different species. And those bars represent how much of the variability in their occurrence we were able to explain with our model, or with the factors within our model. And the factors that we looked at were wild blueberry stem density, which we took as a proxy of management intensity, growing degree days accumulated in the season, topographical wetness index, which is a measure of soil moisture, and then soil organic carbon. And you can see that some of these, the larger the bar means more of the variability we were able to account for in our model, and the smaller the bar, the less. The ones that were the worst at predicting would be these two here and then this one, and those two are fescue grasses, and that's sheep sorrel. So if you know anything about wild blueberry, those are the main weeds in wild blueberry. They occur in like 95% of fields. It's impossible to determine why a species occurs where it does when it occurs everywhere. So that's why we end up with almost no variability explained in there. But what we found from this model, and when we look at the predictions that this model can produce, one is that all of our warm season grasses, things like poverty oakgrass, witchgrass, bentgrass, panagrass, and hair fescue, were all predicted to increase in abundance with increasing growing degree days. So if you think about that in a climate change context, we are getting more growing degree days accumulating throughout our season, suggests that with this model suggests that all of these grasses are going to become more problematic across Nova Scotian blueberry production. The other interesting thing is that sheep sorrel and wild blueberry, this model says that they have the exact same niches. They are occupying the exact same space in fields. So as we select and manage for wild blueberries, we are inevitably selecting and managing for more red sorrel. So it's always going to be an issue. The next model the next thing that we looked at was Nova Scotia forage fields. So again, this is, I think we looked at 60 different forage fields, again, sampled in the same way. And here we, instead of incorporating environmental variables, we looked at management factors because we had a management questionnaire that was included with this survey. And we found that the number of cuts that was made on that forage field, none of these were, they weren't grazed, they were all cut for hay. Number of cuts was kind of important, but the most important factor was the application of fertility in the spring, what fertility went down in the spring, and the application of manure after that first cut. Weed management decisions in the hay crop, did have an impact, but not as big as those fertility decisions. And so we found weed density was lowest when NK or NPK was applied in the spring. One caveat with that NK, it was only one field. So I'd put more emphasis on the NPK, as well as weed density was lower when the manure was applied following cutting. We are going to be digging into more of those species-species relationships, but I just haven't got there yet. The last thing I just want to quickly touch on is the least developed of these, and that's looking at weed communities within the soil quality monitoring network. So here, this is Judith's student, Yvonne. She sampled all of these sites in low, medium, and high tillage intensity across the soil quality monitoring network. And they looked at a whole bunch of soil properties, soil chemical properties, soil nutrient cycling enzymes. But when they were all done with that, they gave us the soil that was left over, and we threw it in the greenhouse and grew out all the weed seeds that were in it. And so we wanted to know, is there any correlation between our weed seed bank community within these 3 tillage intensities and any of our soil chemical properties? So we haven't got to joint species distribution modeling yet with this analysis. So we've just done some kind of preliminary multivariate analysis here. But what we find is that, first of all, the weed seed bank community is more similar in the medium and high tillage intensity compared to the low tillage intensity, which kind of makes sense. We're talking about grasslands versus cropland. So our tillage intensity 1, it tended to go more along this y-axis. So that community tends to move along here, versus our tillage intensity 2 and 3, which is our medium and our high, moved more along this x-axis here and more similar. And these communities were different from each other. When we look at the actual species composition within those communities, we find highly competitive species such as lamb's quarters, annual fleabane, and scentless chamomile only in the medium and high tillage intensity. We did not find them in the low tillage intensity at all. Digging into some of the soil properties, mentioned how our low tillage communities tended to move on that y-axis more. When we looked at that y-axis variable and the soil properties, that seemed to be more related to the C to N concentration of the soil. And the low tillage intensity fields had higher significantly higher C to N ratios than our medium and high tillage intensity. Our medium and high tillage intensity communities, they tended to be more related to K and zinc, but a less of a correlation there than with our low tillage intensity communities. So it said this is just kind of, we're just scratching the surface on this analysis. We want to try and pick out, what are those, any of those factors actually promoting or having any effects on particular species instead of just overall community structure. But we find overall that less competitive species in low tillage areas. And what I think is really interesting is that those adjacent lands don't appear to be refuges for highly competitive species. So even though they may be there and some of those weeds are going to be present in the adjacent fields, they don't seem to be maintained in the seed bank in those grasslands, adjacent grasslands. And then a small increase to C to N ratio, which has implications on nutrient availability, soil microbial community, may select against certain weed species, but I'll put a caveat there. We still need to dig into that with that next stage of modeling. And we'll mention, we're going to apply the joint species distribution models. I have all the paperwork to incorporate crop rotation effects here, just waiting on Kyra Stiles to get back from leave, and then she can send me that data. And then the last thing, I'm working with Charles Geddes and the newly launched Prairie Weed Monitoring Network to take this exact same approach to their long-term data set that they have to try and pull out linkages between different practices and herbicide weed biotypes. So I see my time is out. If I have any time for questions, I'd be happy to take them. If not, there's all my contact information. Feel free to call me, email me, or come visit me whenever. So thank you. All right. Thank you.